This is another one of those long overdue videos, which, fallen by the wayside. This one concerning Fantasy Flight Games, Star Wars, role-playing, and specifically on the topic of NPCs. Not the normal care and feeding of NPCs. This recurring question focuses more on maybe iconic characters, like if you wanted to bring Darth Vader or Boba Fett into your game, how would you handle it? That sort of thing. This is a two-part question. The should you, shouldn't you, and the how would you. So let's start with the how would you first. Bringing in the iconic characters from the films is not much of a concern for me. That's not why I'm running a Star Wars game. But as a group, in the campaign that we are running, the opportunity for this wasn't closed. Now, in past campaigns that I've run, using iconic characters and locations was off the table. We wouldn't go to places like Tatooine or Bespin or something. We wouldn't ever encounter a Han Solo or a Luke Skywalker. It was just simply said from the beginning, this is not going to happen. The Star Wars universe is a universe. We don't need to run into these characters or be involved in the storylines of the films. In this one, we left it more open than that. While the focus was not going to be on the focus of the films, you might encounter some iconic characters. And in fact, in our campaign, Captain Paul Highwind has expressed more than once how much he would like to meet Han Solo. So, who knows? How would I do that? How would I bring in an iconic character? I think the knee-jerk reaction of pretty much any game master is to throw a lot of points at it. These are iconic characters, therefore they are going to be more powerful. I'm not sure that's always true. You can see Fantasy Flight Games take on Lando in the Jewel of Yavin. People might agree, disagree with how it's represented there, that character. And you'll find the same sort of discussion cropping up around the mechanical representations of species. I think that species X should have a higher agility than this, that, or the other thing. So why am I bringing this up? Well, perception and preference plays a very strong role. So for me, as the game master and the person who will be portraying this iconic character, the essence comes down to how can I, with my tools of portrayal at the table and my understanding of that character from the film and my understanding of my player's understanding of that character from the film, tweaked to represent our decision that the films be taken as let's say historical documents or perspectives from unreliable narrators. So who is this character really? Who is this character going to be represented as in our campaign? And how can I bring that sense of the character across? Those are my primary concerns. Not points, not even so much careers or gear, but how will I help the players experience that character in some way? This includes decisions like, will you try or avoid imitating their voice or manner of speaking? Do you do a reasonable Vader? Can you make a convincing Wookiee noise? Do you have the patter and the confidence of a Han Solo, or the smooth and sweet talking charm of Lando? Do you have the earnestness to portray Luke, the simple sincerity there? how are you going to represent them? Are you going to take a step back and describe them? Or are you going to inhabit them? These are my initial concerns when bringing in an NPC like this. What is their function in the film? Right? Are they an active participant in the action, like Luke? Are they a game player at the center of a web, like the Emperor? Are they a force for change in a scene, for hard decisions, for fear, like Vader? What actual function do they serve in the story represented in the films? And how will that need to be translated in whatever scene they appear in your game? How can you best bring that out as the game master? By taking on the role of that character, by speaking in the first person, I am your father, and your father, and your father. Or if it's better to describe them from the outside. All right. Vader walks into the room, his cloak sweeping out behind him, and the temperature of the room dropping as all the stormtroopers, clutch their weapons more tightly, worried that his attention will fall on them. Right. How can you best serve that scene? How can you best develop the impact of that iconic character? This is a decision I think about. From the early stages of our campaign, I knew it was only a matter of time before the group dealt with Jabba the Hutt. It was a part of a character's backstory, and it was a very well developed part, so it made sense, and it seemed logical that eventually, when necessary, that dealing with the Hutts, and likely Jabba in particular, was going to happen. So I began to think pretty early on about how I would try and bring Jabba out. I felt like his patter, the way he speaks, was fairly easy to bring out, or at least remind people. And his body language, of course, is very simple. So how would I represent Jabba? There's the laugh, right? We want to have the laugh involved, and the relative lack of mobility, the stare, and the mercurial nature, shifting from the jovial and the welcoming and the loving to I'm going to kill you now, the almost psychotic nature of Jabba, the threat. And that's a very important part of any iconic character. The threat, or the reputation that the character carries, more so than the point value or the distribution of abilities. Depending on the scene that they actually appear in, it may not be necessary for you to have detailed statistics at all. It may not be necessary for dice to be involved in the encounter. It may be enough to simply exchange dialogue, or they see the character from afar, or there's some other interaction which doesn't actually break down into having to apply the system, opposed roles versus that character, for example. Now, that really does depend on the character. If they're being hunted down by the notorious bounty hunter Boba Fett, if they're being pursued by Lord Vader, if one of the other iconic characters is against them in some way, or working with them in some way, eventually dice will have to hit the table. How do we do that? In Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars role-playing, we have maybe an easier time of doing this than in previous games. You can sit down and plot out a character the same way that you would a PC, right? You could say, well, this is a very important character, so I should know every detail about what they can do. And that's fine. And you say, well, what does the character need to be able to do, and how many points should I give it? Or you can you can approach it any number of different ways based on your experience as a game master. However, the reputation of a character doesn't necessarily need to match their capabilities. They could be far more powerful than they are perceived. Right? Chancellor Palpatine being an example there. Or, if we want to take, the last appearance on film of Boba Fett very seriously, they could be much less capable than they are perceived. Han Solo is terrified of Boba Fett, but in the actual encounter, Boba Fett actually turns out to be quite comical. Now, this might not be your preference for imagining Boba Fett. You might say that, George Lucas, the creator and creative force behind the character, made an error here. He played it too, stupidly, played it funny for the kids in the audience, stripping Boba Fett of all of his cool threat. You might be right. I might agree. But what I'm saying is that what we see on film doesn't necessarily equate to points in the game. Doesn't necessarily do it, doesn't have to do it, and the perceived reputation of the character doesn't have to be the reality of the situation. One of the benefits, but also one of the drawbacks of iconic characters is the strong opinions or perspectives on these characters by the audience. We all have our maybe favorite scenes involving that characters, and some people can have a blind spot about other scenes in which they were involved. Only this moment encapsulates the character of Luke Skywalker, and we'll forget about something else that contradicts it, which is one of the reasons why our group chose to view the films as coming from unreliable narrators. It's like someone is telling you the story, and the details might not necessarily be true. And the representation of the characters over the course of the body of work that the films represent, their depiction might represent more about the narrator in that moment than about the actual character. So that gives us some freedom to drop the things we don't find satisfying. There isn't a single person that plays at my table that likes how Boba Fett is taken out in Return of the Jedi. And for the other characters, the return of Darth Maul is met with some discussion. How does one survive being cut in half and left after a seemingly endless fall down a ventilation shaft of some kind in the middle of a war when emergency services are, on and on and on and on. A character in a scene with no allies. So there are things that you might want to not include in your representation of the character, including whether or not they survived or did not survive from a particular encounter in film. If you want Boba Fett to continue, you can certainly make that happen. He has the tools and talents for real to survive his ignominious death in the stomach of the Sarlacc. Or he didn't. He was digested there over 1,000 years. Yahoo! Whatever. How is your Vader going to be represented? What kind of force powers will they have? Temptation, of course, is to give them all the force powers, and they're all max, and no one can beat Vader except, well, then how do you represent the Emperor? Do you want to use the core rules to represent everything we've seen in the films, or are those core rules only going to represent what is available to characters? And some of these iconic characters coming from an earlier age have access to more mysterious powers. I mean, these are all questions that start to come up. And I feel the way to address them is, what am I willing to do with those characters? And why am I bringing those characters in in the first place. This is where the method of representing adversaries in Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars role-playing begins to take on an advantage, or give us an advantage, because rather than having these large stat blocks that are exactly the same as the player characters, what we have instead is adversaries represented as very specific things that we need them to do. So this applies from the simplest minion stormtrooper, whose basic job is to show up in armor and shoot at things. But it carries on through to Jabba the Hutt or Darth Vader. What can they do? And while the small stat block might get larger and larger as you add in talents or force powers, the idea holds true. I don't need to sit down and imagine every possible career and specialization and talent down the talent tree that this character probably could have maybe developed. All I need to do is focus on what I've seen them do in the movies, those iconic things that the players are going to want to see, such as Vader's force choke. How am I going to represent his force choke? Make sure that he can do that. And what specifically is needed from them that has brought them into the campaign in the first place. Do you intend this character to get into conflict? And is your intent to scare them? How are you going to make that happen? Right? How are you going to control not only the minds and reactions of the players in that moment in your game environment? How are you going to get them to control the actions of their characters in response to that? Can you script a scene so that you get what you want out of it? This is the other big problem of using iconic characters. In film, when Vader walks in, he's treated with amazing respect, right? And he's able to handle whatever comes at him. Han Solo tears out his blaster in the dining room in Bespin's Cloud City, fires, and Vader's able to use, protect to deal with the blaster bolt, and he's unharmed. Well, are you willing to put that to the test of the dice? Are you willing to just hand wave and say it's Vader, so this happens? Are you going to plot armor this iconic character and have it move through the scene in order to make specific things happen? These are all decisions that need to be considered in ways that are completely different from when you're creating your own NPCs and allowing the future of your campaign to develop itself. So now we're drifting into the should you, shouldn't you part. And it's Star Wars. It's supposed to be fun. Characters are supposed to be larger than life. And you're coming down to just one decision. Are the events of the films sacrosanct or not? If you've set your game where it's set in the core books, right? The Death Star, the original Death Star, has only recently been destroyed. We're before the Battle of Hoth. We're before the events of Empire, and we are after the events of A New Hope. Is it important to you and your group that the events of the films actually happen? If they actually happen, this means that your characters cannot change them, or the representation of those events happening in the films glosses over, misses, or in some way doesn't notice the characters because it's being told from someone else's point of view, someone else who doesn't know all the details and that sort of thing. Right? Those are decisions you need to make. And it's exactly these kinds of decisions which can encourage people to say, you know what, it's just not worth the effort of bringing in iconic characters, or it's too hard. Well, maybe it's too hard. Over the last 2 years, I've had the opportunity to bring in a lot of NPCs, and it hasn't really been necessary, other than with Jabba, to bring in iconic characters, although I have had a lot of fun misdirecting the players into thinking that maybe they were going to meet others. But as I said at the beginning of the clip, it's not off the table. They could meet the iconic characters at any time. But the group knows that the future is not set. And the group has chosen not to get caught up in the Galactic Rebellion. The group has chosen not to seek out Luke Skywalker or try to find Leia Organa. They've steered clear of all of that. And little by little, of course, as events in the campaign have played out, they've played their own role. They've developed their own role against the Empire and against the forces that challenge even their somewhat gray morality. And as the Force-sensitive in the group grows more and more in tune with the will of the Force, even so, the desire to connect with the Last Jedi or whatever hasn't really manifested. They're leading their own lives. The galaxy is a huge place. The demands before them, the immediate demands of protecting themselves and the people that they care about, they have more significance, perhaps, than the possible thrill of meeting someone famous. But what I'm describing here is the environment of long-term, open-ended campaign play. This is not a one-shot or a demo game for a convention where you want to, show someone the awe and majesty, the thrill, the excitement of the game. There are many situations where having the iconic characters be available and represented can be your advantage. Now, you won't find them really statted out in the books. There are some exceptions, but you don't go to the adversaries chapter and find Vader. So what do you do? Right? How do you make this character? My recommendation is to keep it as simple as possible. The last thing I feel that you want is to have the game bog or slow down because you suddenly have to access a lot of notes about a character that you haven't been playing as a character. The game is fairly light and compartmentalized, so as a player you quickly get used to checking your talents to make sure how to use them or whatever, and you've got your skill list, and soon that just enters memory. But as the game master, you are constantly changing roles and levels of capability, and even though you may have spent a lot of time developing your representation of that iconic character, for a lot of us, in a conflict of one kind or another, you end up having to suddenly stop talking and look at your notes to find out what the character can do right now. So, taking a cue from how these adversaries are represented in the core books, I think is the wisest thing. To represent them with the least amount of information and have that information be the most specific things that they need to be able to do. Right? How well should they be able to defend themselves? I find it's best to keep things simple like that. How well can they defend themselves? How well can they attack? Out of all the available talents, out of all the minutiae that's now available through the different careers and specializations, which things were made specifically based on that iconic character? A great example that comes easily to mind is Luke Skywalker and exhaust port. Right? That's a talent that you really want Luke Skywalker to have. Now, maybe in your game, it's not going to appear. And that's the other consideration. What are they actually going to do in the scene? What do I need to make sure I know how to do to run them in the scene? Now, there are millions, it seems, of talents. How much grit should they have? How much durability should they have? How much parry or reflect should they have? And on and on and on. Some of these things need your specific attention, maybe parry and reflect in particular. Others don't, and the game has given you great shorthand in the form of the adversary talent. This is shorthand for the game master so that you do not have to give yourself page after page of notes about these iconic characters. You can very simply create them and apply the adversary talent instead of pouring through specialization charts to figure out how large their wound threshold should be, and so on and so on. Right? The effect turns out to be the same. And by extension, it means we need to be careful of when we use adversary and when we don't. And if you go through the adversaries chapter and pay attention to the types of characters that get adversary assigned to them, and work out for yourself when you want to assign adversary 1, adversary 2, or heaven forfend, adversary 3, I feel you'll be doing yourself a better service than spending a long time figuring out exactly which careers, which specializations, which talents to put into an iconic character. There's a new series of videos that I'll link to in the description box where Tim Cask talks about original D&D and a lot of old chestnuts, stories that have circulated and recirculated and been recast into memes almost. You're getting kind of straight from the horse's mouth about early concepts in gaming. And recently, one that he mentioned was about if you give something stats, the players will try to kill it. And this is really what I'm getting at. The more detailed, the more complicated, the more explicit you make your iconic characters, the more trouble you're going to have with them. Either you will, in reaction to something awesome that a character has done, you will divert your attention to the character sheet to see if you've got a counter for that thing, and so on. It's not really in the nature of the game, I want to say, to play it that way. How do I stat Vader? What force power should he have at what level? What should his force rating be? Oh my god, blah! Instead, try and use very specific talents to create the sense of the character. And then, if you want your campaign to be open-ended, meaning not tied to the outcome of the existing films, go with it. If your intent is to make the canonical events of the films immutable in your campaign, then statting out the character really serves no purpose, right? There are certain things that can't happen, and you as the game master are simply there to say they don't happen. And spending a lot of time on the minutia of the iconic character will either be, because the canonical events cannot change, a waste of time, or it will be a distraction to you as the game master, meaning you can't really sell that character in the scene because you're checking your notes, which would be a shame. Or it's not an efficient use of your time because shorthand has been developed for you in the form of talents like adversary. So this is probably going to edit out to be a very long video on something that's pretty simple. Let's recap. If you're going to include iconic characters, you have to decide on whether or not the future as shown in the films can change. Can your PCs take on Boba Fett and prevent him from showing up at Jabba's palace when Han Solo is freed by, the heroes of the films? Is that a possible thing? If it's not a possible thing, then don't use too much of your time statting this character out. Just figure out how effective they should be in attack and basic defense, and be prepared for things like coincidence, interruption, and whatnot to enable that aspect of Railroad to take shape in a fun way for your group. If your future is going to be open, then how can you use your body language, your voice, your attitude, and certain iconic talents to make the players feel like they had a brush with that character? That's the essence of what we're going for. That's the essence of how the game was designed. The talents were written that way. Things like exhaust port, things like storage compartment, and so on and so forth. They were lifted from the characters and turned into this very small little text box that encapsulates the essence of a certain action from the films. Take that attitude to heart when you're bringing in an iconic character. Jabba the Hutt is more than Jabba's laugh. He's also Jabba's palace, his thugs, that sense of doom as you walk down layer after layer into darkness to his central chamber, right? He is both warmth and a strong sense of revenge and betrayal. Darth Vader is more than mechanical breathing, a lightsaber, and being the biggest badass in the galaxy. Because after all, there's still the Emperor.